Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. While the number of people in prison has significantly declined in the last decade, the number of people in prison who are over the age of 50 has increased, revealing another part of our criminal justice system badly in need of reform. My guest today is Mujahid Farid. He's a 2013 Soros Justice Fellow who was incarcerated for 33 years in New York. He intends to change New York's parole practices, and he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ronnie.
33 years in prison.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit? Let's start with your experience, because then we can go on to what you learned.
Yes, first I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be here and explain
welcome.
the work that we've been engaged in.
I really want to talk about this because I think it's a very serious and unrecognized problem.
Yes. The RAPP campaign, RAPP is an acronym for Release Aging People in Prison. And it's a campaign, a coalition of different organizations and people, and we're trying to address a broken parole process in New York. And we decided to intersect at that broken parole process at the point of how it impacts upon the elderly.
That's why I want to talk about your experience.
Yes.
Because you were sentenced to 15 years to life, right?
Correct.
And how old were you? 28?
I was 28 at the time.
And so tell us what happened.
At the time, I was arrested in 1978. As you said, I went to trial for attempt murder, and I was eventually found guilty after trial and sentenced to 15 years to life. I really didn't expect to serve that time. That was an incredible amount of time for me to fathom at the time. And so, I engaged in almost immediately a lot of legal activities, legal work, trying to get the conviction overturned. And I would just add as a fact that I was innocent of the charge. And so, but in addition to trying to address the legal aspect of the conviction, I realized at the time that I hadn't really led a life that I thought was the most productive. And so I decided almost from the beginning to try to use all of my time that I would spend behind bars wisely, not to waste a day. And so I began engaging in different educational efforts. And in the course of me fighting that conviction, which didn't materialize into a success, by the time I reached that 15-year mark, I had actually earned 4 college degrees. I had earned an associate's in business, a bachelor's degree, and 2 master's degrees. And in addition to that,
I think I read in sociology.
Yeah, one of them was in sociology.
Divinity.
A second degree, one of the masters was in ministry. That was from New York Theological Seminary, and the sociology was from SUNY New Paltz. And so I made incredible academic achievements during the time I was confined. In addition to social achievements, I had been involved in creating different rehabilitative organizations behind the walls. I was one of the original people that started a program that exists today called PACE, Prisoners, AIDS, Counseling, and Education, that still exists behind the walls.
Too.
Yeah, we got that started during the, what I call the dark ages of the AIDS epidemic. And it changed a lot of the dynamics behind the wall that were pretty negative. But in any event, I had done quite a bit of, as I said, academic achievement. I had been involved socially, and I had pretty much gotten my mind away from the type of life that I had previously led and had a whole new way of thinking. And so all of that happened prior to that 15-year mark. And I appeared at the board for release in 1993.
And you went to the board I mean, thinking 15 years to life, so at the end of the 15th year, you're eligible to go to the board.
Yes. In New York State, they have what's called indeterminate sentencing, which a lot of cases get a minimum and a maximum.
I see.
And in the case of the most serious offenses, the maximum is normally life for A1 offenses, which are
This most serious felony.
most serious felonies. The maximum is normally life, and the minimum is maybe anywhere for an adult, 15. It's either 15, 20, or 25. For the adolescents, it can be less.
So when you get ready to go to parole, you gather letters of support?
Yes.
And you had letters of support?
I did. I had letters of support. I had an excellent parole packet that pretty much enumerated all of my achievements, all of the support that I had in the community for my release.
So you go to your parole hearing?
Yes.
And you go alone?
Yes.
And what happened?
It was pretty much a 5-minute hearing, maybe 5 to 7 minutes. And I was dismissed after the brief interview.
What was the first question they asked you?
They ask you about the crime, explain, what happened. It's normally always focused on the original offense. And you talk a bit about that. Most of the time you can tell that, I learned later, you can tell when you're being denied when it doesn't go beyond that, when the conversation lingers on that original offense and doesn't really transition into any of the things that you've done behind the walls
or what you want to do when you get out.
Yeah, and so that's pretty much a signal that things don't look good.
Were people actually in the room, the parole board? They were there.
When I originally started going,
yeah,
that was the case.
Yeah.
Over the years of series
with
of
the original. So you got denied.
I got denied, right. And to answer that question, I actually got denied 9 more times, or 8 more times. I went to 10 parole boards. I got denied 9 times in total and was released at the 10th board, and these are at 2-year increments.
So you apply for parole, you get turned down, you have to wait 2 years before you can apply.
2 years reconsidered.
So 18 years
18
after your
additional
15
years,
years
right,
to life,
right.
you were finally.
Right, and to answer that question you just asked,
Yeah.
during that 18-year period, things kind of transitioned where they would not even do live interviews anymore. They would do them by teleconference. And I stopped having the ability to appear before people live to have that kind of interaction.
That's it. And you're in this room by yourself.
Yeah.
And there's a screen in front of you.
Yes.
And you're just talking to people you don't know and that you really can't see or
a
have to
person
move.
you don't know, because
Yeah.
one of the things that I've noted over the years is that although the law requires 2 to 3 commissioners to consider your release, only one of them are really paying attention. The others, if there's 2 more, they're looking at the cases that are going to follow yours because they're going to be the lead on those cases.
I see. They
So
divide them up.
they divide them up, and say I'm the second commissioner, I'm looking at the person that's coming right behind the person that's sitting there now, and I'm getting a quick scan of the case that's going to be coming up. And so they're not paying attention, and what happens is when they got to because that was obvious before they did the teleconference, when they did develop the teleconference system, as soon as the introductions were complete, the screen would simply focus onto that one individual.
So you never even saw
You
it.
never even see the others.
And that individual then makes a recommendation to the panel of 3.
That's correct. Oh, most oftentimes, let me correct that, the recommendations are already made before you come into the
it's a
room.
decision. Yeah.
And so they're really going through just,
Right. Right.
formatted procedures.
So now you have, so when you finally got out,
Yeah.
you really, You know, most people don't know what the parole process is,
Right.
right? We
Yes.
just don't know. And you've spent 15 years, all of the degrees, all of the decisions that this is the kind of life you're going to lead in the future and not there. And this is what happens. So this led to RAPP, right?
Well, it led to me serving 33 years first, not
Did,
15.
first of all, terrible.
right.
Yeah, double the time.
Right.
It's like double jeopardy, isn't it? I mean, you're being tried again by the parole board.
It really amounts to that because they're not really looking at your accomplishments, the thing that a parole process should be doing, and whether or not you're a risk to be released. They're going back to the original offense and making the determination to deny you based on, that's the language they use, the original offense,
And it's directly the opposite. One of the so-called, the major purpose of incarceration is rehabilitation.
Especially when we are talking about an indeterminate sentencing structure. People that are serving time under those type of sentences. That's the absolute implication of that type of sentence. That there's a minimum imposed for a parole process to look at the person after they have served the minimum and make a determination as to whether or not they continue to be a public risk.
Now, there are two ways really to get out of prison if you have an indeterminate sentence. Right? One is by the governor granting clemency, and the other is by parole, the parole board.
And the third is by death.
Death, which unfortunately happens to
Quite a few people, yes.
Now, is it the fact that, is the parole board come down most heavily on felony convictions?
Yes, because those are the most, those are the convictions that are the political hot potatoes, where you'll find that parole commissioners don't want to take the risk of having a person that they ordered release committing another crime, especially a high-profile crime. And so regardless of all of the indications that the person may be a low risk for release, they're not going to follow those indications. They're going to play it safe.
So what happens is if you serve such a long time, you've spent a lot of years in prison, you're now a much older person than when you went in.
And age is really one of the factors that says a lot about recidivism or a person's propensity to commit another crime after they are released.
The recidivism rate for older people who come out of prison is much lower.
Extremely
It's practically
low.
nothing.
Extremely low.
Yeah, it might be for a violation of parole even.
The majority of elderly people that you will find recidivate, go back to prison, it's going to probably be for a parole violation.
Yeah, not
for committing a crime,
right.
but for not following some regulation that the parole process has imposed upon them.
So keeping you in prison for the extra 16 years,
18
years, I'm sorry, costs the state $60,000 each year.
Well, it costs more than that. It's an average of $60,000 that a person, that it costs the state to house a person. When you're talking about someone that's elderly, 50 years and older, it can be anywhere from 2 to 4 times the average rate.
Something. So it's easier almost to explain to people the economic gains instead of the inhumane treatment, unfortunately.
Well, that's what moves a lot of people, the fact that
they save money.
They clearly see that the state is wasting money, wasting taxpayers' money, their money, when a person that's elderly is being repeatedly denied. They are paying for that. And they're paying for it in terms of the cost of maybe education, housing, and a lot of other things that.
And destruction to a family.
Yeah. Yes.
And to the community.
But that's the humane aspect. When
you separate it out.
Yeah, it's, most people, I wouldn't say most, but there are a segment of people that are only going to respond to the fiscal concerns. And then you have others that, yes, they're more concerned about the humane aspects of this thing.
So we've really got to make more public what parole means. I mean, now we've got law enforcement, and we've certainly had incidents, and a lot of attention is paid to that. We've got attention paid to the court system. So now we've got to get attention paid to the parole system, because that's the other part of the
Yeah, that's the
whole
back end.
criminal justice system.
That's what we call the back end.
The back.
You have the front end, the middle,
Yeah.
and the back end.
So now tell us about RAPP.
RAPP is a campaign that was initiated, conceived while I was working at the Correctional Association of New York. The Correctional Association of New York is the place where I was eventually able to get some employment after my release. And I was employed there for about a year before RAPP was initiated as the court pens monitoring coordinator here in New York City. In other words, my job was to monitor the conditions of the New York City court pens and report on that. Now, the Correctional Association is this year celebrating its 170th anniversary.
And it's mandated by the state with certain responsibilities.
Well, it's only one of two private organizations in the United States, in the whole United States, that has legislative authority to enter the prisons and monitor the conditions. And the Correctional Association has been doing that for a large part of the time that it's been in existence.
So now let's go to RAPP.
Yes, and so as I was saying, I was doing court pens monitoring for the Correctional Association. And while I was doing that work, there were some of us that was concerned about the broken parole system in New York. And we was brainstorming and trying to strategize what can be done that can try to crack a fissure, some fissures into this broken system. We knew that for the past 20, 25 years, there had been a lot of outcry from certain communities about this broken parole system, and there had not been a lot of traction made. And so we set about analyzing the whys and wherefores, and what would be an appropriate strategy to deal with that situation.
There's a bill in the state legislature, but it never gets passed, right?
Well, yeah, you have the Safe Parole Act.
Yeah. We should say that the parole board is appointed by the governor
Yes.
to certain
Definitely.
specific terms.
Right. They're not really, being that you asking about that, you won't find too many of the parole commissioners, and I'm not speaking about all of them. I think some of them are doing a fine job. There's a couple doing a fine job in my estimation. But you won't find the vast majority of them concerned about public safety. They're concerned, as I said, about
Their
own positions, maintaining their positions, not having any media outcry about any decision they made. And so these are people that are appointed by the governor.
Cautious.
And the governor pretty much calls the tune as to how they operate.
There was a case I read where the woman was granted parole, and the New York Post ran a front page story, and they recalled her.
That's called a rescission. They could do rescission hearings, and on many occasions you'll find that happens when someone was convicted of an offense against a police officer, and the police unions find out that the persons were ordered released. They would create an outcry
and
pressure the parole board to rescind that parole decision.
So I thought there were some administrative changes that were supposed to happen with the parole board. There was supposed to be a
There
scale.
actually was.
And do they still do that? Do they use those new things?
All of this was a hot issue right around the time that RAPP came into existence. When RAPP came into existence, we came into existence officially in 2013. But towards the end of 2011, there was some legislation passed, and it was supposed to go in effect in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And the legislation said that the parole board had to incorporate risk and needs assessment in their decision-making process. And we came into existence, as I said, in 2013, and even by the end of that year, the parole board hadn't done anything to implement that process. They had not changed their regulations, their parole regulations. And we made that a big issue in December of 2013. There was a public hearing being held in Albany, sponsored by Senator O'Donnell. And we put that on the table, the fact that no parole regulations had been structured to incorporate that statute that had been passed. And that pretty much they had been operating in the same fashion that they had been for the last 20 years. Rubber stamping denials, not considering risk and needs. And the strangest thing is that when we appeared in Albany that December, we learned that the day before our hearing, they had actually floated some new regulations. And so that pretty much put us in a tizzy. We wasn't prepared for that. But we came back out of Albany, came home, and we looked up the regulations that they were proposing and discovered that they was absolutely toothless. That in no way would these regulations that they had restructured them require them to really focus their attention on a person's risk for release. And I might add that one of the things we learned when we designed our campaign and focused on the elderly, we learned that almost to a person that these people were being scored low risk for recidivism or committing new crimes. The state of New York actually has an instrument to measure this. And these people were being measured.
But it didn't matter.
It didn't matter. It didn't matter. They was totally ignoring these risk assessments scores that the people were receiving. And so we made a stink of that, and we filed, we organized the community to file comments to the regulations they were proposing. And we also learned that normally when new regulations are being proposed by an agency, the agency usually receives anywhere from 30 to 60 comments, and that in our case, 300 had been filed. And with the vast majority of them opposing these new regulations that the parole board were tending. And they just sat quiet for a while, and a few months later, they just bum rushed through what they had proposed without a comment about the public's concern about what they were doing.
So it's State Senator O'Donnell, who is...
He's an assemblyman.
He's a member of the legislature
Right,
from the west side of Manhattan.
Okay, right.
He is the chair of the Corrections Committee.
That's right.
And he's reintroducing this bill.
Which bill?
What's the...
The Safe Parole Act?
Yeah. Is that a good bill?
Oh, yes. It's an excellent bill.
I read that he plans to reintroduce that bill.
The Safe Parole Act is an excellent bill. It would take away their ability to focus on the original offense. It would take away that power from the parole.
That's very important.
Yes, but what we are arguing at RAPP is that with the regulation that passed in 2011, they should already be doing that.
Yeah.
They should already be doing that, and they're not doing it. And of course, the Safe Parole Act would seal that process. But we say in the interim, they should be doing the right thing. They should be releasing people based on their risk assessments, and irrespective of the fact that the Safe Parole bill has not passed.
So the parole RAPP is, it's a, what, an organizing, policy and organizing?
Yeah, we try to change parole policies, release policies, and we do a lot of grassroots organizing in the community.
Right. And we need so much more than what we've discussed. I mean, even with people over 50, we're talking about different populations. There are people over 50 like you who are going to go out and do a lot
Positive
of
things
active
in it.
things,
Yes.
right? There are people over 50 who are in wheelchairs
That's
and
correct.
75 years old
correct.
or 80 years
Right.
old who need really hospice or hospital care. There are people who are
Absolutely.
dying and they can't get out of prison.
Absolutely.
So it
So
is
we have
such a long,
spectrum.
complicated, it's not a simple thing.
Yeah, there's a spectrum of the elderly that we're talking about. We're talking about those that can come home and make major contributions to the community insofar as trying to break that process of mass incarceration. And we also talk about the elderly, as you said, who are infirm. There's quite a few of those. And I might mention that recently, that became a concern of RAPP's. When we first launched our campaign, we did an informal survey in the community as to how the people felt about what we were going to become engaged in, trying to get these people released. And we found that there was not a lot of opposition to that, but there was a lot of concern about what happens to them upon their release.
Now, we're at the end of our program, so you're obviously going to have to come back because we're going to have to talk about all these other things that we need to change.
Right.
Right. So I just thank you so much, Farid, and it's been, it's just overwhelming, and we will continue our discussion.
And as I said, I thank you for giving us this opportunity
Very
to talk a
welcome.
little bit about our program and the work we engaged in.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.